Arrian, the ancient biographer of Alexander of Macedon, includes in his work a letter that Alexander purportedly wrote to Darius, king of the Persians, whom Alexander had just defeated in battle. Your ancestors invaded Macedonia and the rest of Greece and did us harm, although we had not done you any previous injury. I have been appointed commander-in-chief of the Greeks, and it is with the aim of punishing the Persians that I have crossed into Asia, since you are the aggressors. My father died at the hands of conspirators instigated by you, as you yourself boasted to everybody in your letters. You sent unfriendly letters to the Greeks about me to push them to war against me. Your envoys corrupted my friends and sought to destroy the peace which I established among the Greeks. I therefore led an expedition against you, and now I have defeated in battle first your generals, and now you in person and your army, and by the grace of the gods, I control the country. In future, whenever you communicate with me, address me as King of Asia. Do not write to me as an equal, but state your demands to the master of all your possessions. If you wish to lay claim to the title of king, then stand your ground and fight for it. Do not take to flight, as I shall pursue you wherever you may be. Alexander refers here to Persian complicity in the murder of his father, Philip II, who with the assistance of his son Alexander had defeated Greek armies at the Battle of Chaeronea in August 338 BCE, which gave the Macedonians control over much of Greece. But this victory was intended to be just the prelude to Philip's real aim of leading a combined Macedonian and Greek army against the Persians. Philip's assassination meant that the task would be taken up by Alexander, who set out in 336 BCE on one of the most audacious campaigns in history. Alexander's campaign marked the beginning of a fresh chapter in the history of civilization. It ushered in a new era during which Greek civilization expanded across vast regions of Afro-Eurasia. Alexander's letter also suggests that since the end of the Peloponnesian War, the Persians had continued to meddle in Greek affairs, pursuing policies that aimed to keep Greece fragmented. Many Greeks lost faith in democracy, and some openly called for the appearance of a benevolent tyrant who would reunite the polis, although few would have expected this champion to come from Macedonia. Until the mid-4th century, Macedonia had been seen as little more than a rugged frontier state to the north of Greece, home to peasant farmers and seasonal pastoralists. But Macedonian elites had quietly prospered through trade with the wealthy cities of Greece based on the export of natural resources like grain and timber, and this commercial relationship had allowed the elites to become increasingly well acquainted with Greek culture. One such member of the Macedonian nobility was Philip II, and during his lengthy reign as king between 359 and 336 BCE, Macedonia emerged as a powerful and sophisticated state in its own right. In his youth, Philip had gained considerable expertise in Greek military history and strategy. And once he became king, he used this knowledge to build a formidable military by uniting the experienced and well-trained Macedonian cavalry with the Greek infantry formation known as the hoplite phalanx. With these forces, Philip methodically annexed the northern Greek cities, and although all Greeks recognized the threat posed by Philip, the Peloponnesian War had so poisoned the atmosphere that the formation of any sort of alliance to stop the Macedonians was impossible. Even when Athens and Thebes did act belatedly to join forces against the Macedonians, their armies were destroyed at the Battle of Chaeronea. Philip allowed the Greek polis to retain their own governments, vowed that he would crush any who rose up against him, and then began to make preparations to invade the Persian Empire. It was on the eve of departure that Philip was assassinated, perhaps with Persian complicity, as Alexander suggests. Alexander quickly assumed control, gained the support of the Macedonian nobility, and crushed the only attempted Greek uprising against him in Thebes. At the age of 21, he prepared to carry out his father's aim of destroying the Persian Empire. Alexander was apparently of average height and looks, but he was a superb athlete and horseman, a charismatic leader, and a gifted military strategist. The new king of Macedonia and Greece was also highly educated. His tutor had been none other than the great philosopher Aristotle, whom Philip had engaged when Alexander was just 14 years old. Aristotle set up his royal school at Mysia and for the next 6 years educated his star pupil in ancient languages, in the epic tales of Homer, in natural history and astronomy, in rhetoric and in ethics, including the importance of avoiding loose women. By the age of 20, Alexander was ready to wage war against the Persians like a new Achilles, destined to leave his own indelible mark upon the world. Crossing the Bosphorus and marching into Asia Minor, Alexander's force of 43,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry gained an early victory over the Persians in May of 334 BCE at the river Granicus, a victory that liberated the Greek colonies along the Ionian coast. While wintering in Gordium early in 333, Alexander famously solved the ancient problem of the Gordian knot, an intricate knotting of bark that is reputed to have firmly tied an ox cart to a post and confounded any attempts to undo it. His biographers offer conflicting accounts of Alexander's solution. Either he undid the knot quite easily by removing a pin from the middle of it, or he simply sliced it through with his sword. However he did it, the phrase Gordian knot has since evolved into a metaphor for an insoluble problem, and an Alexandrian solution is a means of overcoming that problem by thinking outside the box. After solving the problem of the knot, Alexander was certain that the gods were on his side, so he was not surprised when he again defeated King Darius and the Persians in a second battle south of the ancient city of Issus in Turkey. This was the battle that led to the writing of the letter that Arrian records in his biography. After being held up for 6 months by a siege of the Phoenician city of Tyre, Alexander marched south into Egypt, where at a small coastal village he decided to found a new city. Not surprisingly, he named the city Alexandria, and this Alexandria would turn out to be not only the first, but also the greatest of the 70 or so cities he founded in his campaign. Arrian informs us that Alexander himself wanted to lay out the city's outline, but with no writing or drafting material available, he was forced to mark out his plan with grain. Later in the lecture, we will see how Alexandria evolved into one of the most important cities in the ancient world. In Egypt, Alexander was greeted as a liberator, and after visiting the oracle of the Egyptian god Ammon, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus, he began to see himself as semi-divine, announcing that his true father was the most powerful of all the gods, Zeus Ammon. Alexander now took an unexpected northern route to march rapidly into Mesopotamia for a fateful third confrontation with Darius and the Persians. After crossing the Tigris River with great difficulty due to its strong current, Alexander prepared to confront Darius on an open, flat plain just east of the city of Mosul in modern Iraq. Darius chose this field at Gaugamela because he thought he would be better able to deploy his huge army and chariots, and because it contained no waterways or hills that might give Alexander any sort of advantage. The Persian forces numbered perhaps 200,000 men, including infantry, cavalry, archers, 200 chariots with menacing blades mounted on each side, and war elephants. Alexander's force numbered around 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Despite being grossly outnumbered, Alexander struck the decisive blow of the Battle of Gaugamela by forming his units into an unstoppable wedge, which he personally led deep into the Persian center, completely unnerving Darius and changing the course of history as a result. Arrian describes the flight of the Persian king from the field of battle. When the Macedonian cavalry, commanded by Alexander himself, pressed on vigorously, thrusting themselves against the Persians and striking their faces with their spears, and when the Macedonian phalanx, in dense array and bristling with long pikes, had also made an attack upon them, all things together appeared full of terror to Darius, who had already long been in a state of fear, so that he was the first to turn and flee. In the aftermath, Alexander captured or killed large numbers of Persian soldiers and also captured a huge treasure before marching triumphantly into Babylon. After resting for a month, Alexander continued on to the Persian capital of Persepolis, capturing an even greater quantity of treasure and allowing his drunken soldiers to burn and loot the city. Marching next towards modern Tehran to try and capture Darius, Alexander was dismayed to find that the Persian king had already been murdered by a kinsman named Bessus. This gave Alexander the excuse he needed to push on deep into Central Asia. ostensibly to punish Bessus for this act of regicide, but really because he did not want to be cut off in mid-career, as his biographers put it. After capturing several of the great trading cities of Central Asia, such as Samarkand, Alexander took his men across the snow-covered Hindu Kush and into Bactria, where he married Roxana, the beautiful daughter of a Sogdian nobleman. Despite the obvious strategic advantages in this union, some historians have interpreted Alexander's marriage as part of a deliberate policy to unite European men and Asian women to create a new master race. Certainly, he insisted that 80 other Macedonian or Greek officers also take Persian wives, and he gave dowries to 10,000 Macedonian soldiers who agreed to marry native wives. With Central Asia now more or less secured, Alexander marched south across the Khyber Pass into the Indus River Valley, where he was confronted by a powerful local ruler named Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Once again, Alexander's audacious strategy paid off. Crossing the Jhelum River in absolute secrecy with a small force, he attacked Porus's flank, and even though the battle was costly for the Macedonians, Porus surrendered. The longer-term significance of this victory, the final battle Alexander would ever fight, might not have been immediately apparent, but by creating a power vacuum in the region, it allowed the young Indian prince Chandragupta to build the Mauryan Empire. The Battle of the Hydaspes was also important in the history of civilization more broadly, because it opened up much of India to Greek political, economic, and cultural influences in the centuries that followed. With all of India now open to him, Alexander was keen to press on, but after this bloody battle, his troops had had enough and refused to go any further. Reluctantly, Alexander was obliged to abandon his campaign and turn for home. Alexander sent some of his forces back in a newly built fleet that sailed from the mouth of the Indus River to Babylon by sea, while he personally led the rest of his troops back by a new route through the harsh Gedrosian desert of Baluchistan with considerable losses. The two expeditions were reunited in Susa, where Alexander held a great feast to celebrate his long and victorious campaign, before returning to Babylon, where he took up residence in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II. The king of Europe and Asia began to make preparations for new campaigns, including a maritime expedition on the Caspian Sea. But following a prolonged bout of drinking and feasting, Alexander fell ill and died on June the 11th, 323 BCE, at the age of just 33. Alexander had ruled for only 13 years, but by facilitating a changing of the guard from Persian to Greco-Macedonian rule, he had irrevocably altered the geopolitical context of a huge region of Western Afro-Eurasia, and also made possible the colonization of much of the region by the conquerors. Alexander's campaigns also led to an astonishing flow of wealth from the Persian realm to the Mediterranean. The pillaging of Persepolis alone added something like 2,500 tons of gold to the Greco-Macedonian treasury and constituted the greatest single capture of wealth in world history to that point. When Alexander died, the seemingly unified Greco-Macedonian empire he had created was quickly plunged into crisis as his generals fought to carve up the empire. What emerged after 50 years of conflict was a three-part polycentric Hellenistic empire that survived until the Romans eventually incorporated much of the region into their own expansive state. Seleucus Nicator, who had been an infantry general under Alexander, gained control of a huge swathe of territory, stretching from Turkey to the Indus River, with Mesopotamia as its heartland. It was in this vast new Seleucid empire that Greek influence reached its greatest extent. Another of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy Soter, gained control of Egypt, which he turned into a successful and wealthy state based on the export of wheat. Under Ptolemy and his successors, Egypt became the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world and also a major center of intellectual activity. The Ptolemies ruled as divine pharaohs, but did not otherwise interfere in Egyptian society, focusing instead on the economy and on establishing royal monopolies on the most lucrative sectors, just as rulers from Mesopotamia to Egypt to China had done before them. Alexander's homeland of Macedonia and the Greek polis to the south were now ruled by another trusted assistant, Antigonus I. Cities like Athens and Corinth flourished during the Hellenistic era as trading centres, and class tensions within these Greek cities were eased by sending large numbers of Greeks to colonise the Seleucid Empire. It was this expansion of Greek colonisation and economic activity throughout the Hellenistic empires that allowed for the extensive spread of Greek civilization. Just like in Persia, China, and India, the establishment of sophisticated cosmopolitan societies integrated millions of humans through common beliefs and cultural norms. Several of the new cities that Alexander himself had established were at the centre of this Hellenization of much of Afro-Eurasia, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Some never evolved to be more than fortified settlements or administrative centres, but others developed into thriving metropolises that attracted large numbers of Greek and Macedonian colonists. One fascinating Central Asian example is the Hellenistic city of Ai-Khanoum, founded at the confluence of two rivers in modern Afghanistan. The city was built on a hill and divided into two sections, an acropolis on the summit and a city at its base protected by walls 25 feet thick and up to 30 feet high. This Greek city in the heart of Asia has been extensively excavated by archaeologists. It featured a broad central avenue, an arsenal, a gymnasium dedicated to the Greek god Heracles, a royal palace and treasury, a library, and a 5,000-seat Greek theatre. Another example of the extensive spread of Greek culture during the Hellenistic era is the fact that Greek language was now so widely spoken that even the great Indian Mauryan Emperor Ashoka felt it necessary to have his Sanskrit edicts simultaneously promulgated in both Greek and Aramaic, the two most common languages of the Hellenistic era. All the Hellenistic cities show signs of a surging economy based on commerce, with new centres of wealth emerging, particularly in Syria and Egypt, and new middle-class commercial elites becoming powerful enough to challenge the traditional nobility. As the political, intellectual, and economic centre of the Greek world shifted from the classical Greek polis to these new cities, Greek civilization lost its inward-looking, civic-focused character and became increasingly cosmopolitan. The mainland Greek cities also turned away from their earlier experiments in democratic government, which no longer worked in polis that were now small parts of much larger imperial structures. This meant that one of the most cherished contributions of ancient Greece to modern civilization essentially disappeared for millennia. No city typifies the cosmopolitanism of the Hellenistic era more than the city that Alexander had personally founded on the shores of the Mediterranean in Egypt, Alexandria. Now the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt, enormous wealth flowed through Alexandria, the greatest bureaucratic, economic, and intellectual centre of the Hellenistic world. Alexandria's enormous harbour could accommodate 1,200 ships at any one time, making it the most important port, not just in the Mediterranean, but indeed the entire world in the 3rd century BCE. Can we imagine the atmosphere in this huge megalopolis, one of the first genuinely global cities in world history, with people from all over Afro-Eurasia residing there? These residents are of very different religious and cultural traditions. Egyptians certainly, but also Greeks, Macedonians, Phoenicians, Jews, Arabs, Babylonians, all learning to conduct their affairs in a spirit of multiculturalism and tolerance. Because of the wealth of the Ptolemies, Alexandria also became an intellectual centre of Western Afro-Eurasia after the government established the Alexandria Museum there, an institute of higher learning where philosophers, writers, and scientists were able to carry out advanced research. Attached to the centre was the famous Alexandrian Library, which by the 1st century BCE had a collection of hundreds of thousands of scrolled manuscripts, along with meeting rooms, lecture theatres, and dining areas. Really, it sounds a lot like my university campus today. The library is also famous for being burned to the ground, but rather than a single disaster, there appear to have been several conflagrations. The Roman historian Plutarch blames Julius Caesar for accidentally setting fire to the library in 48 BCE. Later historians blame the Roman Emperor Aurelian for starting a fire around the year 275 of the Common Era, and yet others blame the Christian patriarch Theophilus for destroying whatever remained of the library in 391 as part of a deliberate destruction of pagan sites. The growth of new cities like Alexandria across the Hellenistic world tended to eclipse the reputation and wealth of the ancient polis on mainland Greece. And this had ramifications for Greek philosophy, which now had to function in a much larger, more cosmopolitan context. Because the ancient polis were no longer self-governing states, but small parts of much larger imperial structures, their residents were forced to become more international in outlook. At the same time, Greeks were now living all over the Hellenistic world, from India to Egypt. So the new philosophical schools that emerged were designed to help people, wherever they dwelt, make sense of this vast and confusing new geopolitical environment. 3 of those schools proved very attractive to the Romans, and as a result, they have remained deeply embedded in the Western psyche ever since. I'm thinking of Epicureanism, skepticism, and Stoicism, each of which in its own way addressed the problem of how to find purpose and calm in the midst of a chaotic world. The Epicureans focused on the pleasures of life, not through living a life of excess or unbridled hedonism, but by enjoying the simple pleasures to achieve a state of quiet satisfaction as a way of protecting themselves against the pressures of life. The skeptics, who doubted the possibility of any certain knowledge, decided that it was futile to advocate strong positions on any moral, social, or political issue. Instead of engaging in fruitless disputes, they sought to establish a sense of calm and equanimity, leaving others to debate the contentious issues of the day. But the most respected of the new philosophers were the Stoics, who argued that while some of the events that take place in life are under our control, many others are not. To find peace, we need to focus only on those matters we actually have some control over and ignore those that we do not. The Stoics argued for all things in moderation. As their greatest philosopher Epictetus said, "Behave in life as though you are at a banquet. Take only a portion of each thing that comes before you. Don't be boisterous or excessive. Don't overindulge. If you hear someone speaking ill of you, agree with them that you have many faults." Early in your life, establish a certain stamp of character that you will maintain whether alone or in public, and whether in times of triumph or tragedy. Even death is beyond our control, so why worry about it? We are all actors in a play. If our role is long or short, so be it. If our role is beggar or king, so be it. Science and technology also made some fascinating advances in Alexandria during the Hellenistic era, including in agriculture after the Ptolemies introduced new strains of grain and more efficient use of irrigation. The Ptolemies were also innovators in construction technology, building an impressive causeway almost a mile long to connect Alexandria to the island of Pharos, on which they erected a large lighthouse to guide ships safely into the enormous harbour. Measuring perhaps 450 feet in height, the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria was the tallest building in the world for many centuries. It was also one of the longest surviving of all the ancient monuments, only being finally abandoned after it was destroyed by an earthquake in 1323, 1,500 years after its construction. There were 2 other quite extraordinary fields in which Alexandrian scientists made technological advances: automata and pneumatics. Automata scientists built machines that could move on their own without human intervention, the forerunner to the sort of automatic devices we take for granted today. These machines had built into them some sort of program that could dictate the sequence of movements inside the apparatus, so their builders could devise new ways of translating mechanical movements. One such automaton in Alexandria was able to convert back and forth movement in one part of the machine into a rotational movement in another part. The science of pneumatics, a word that comes from the Greek word pneuma, for a puff of air or for breath, was focused on the properties of air. Alexandrian scientists worked out that flowing air could produce different sounds, and that by heating air they could increase its pressure. So thousands of years before James Watt and George Stephenson, Hellenistic inventors figured out that by using heat to create steam, they could in turn use the steam power to generate movement. With the disintegration of Hellenistic civilization, this knowledge essentially disappeared for 2 millennia until it was rediscovered in the 18th century and applied to the invention of the steam engine. Hellenistic sculptors also produced some of the abiding masterpieces of all Greek art, including two statues that many of you may have seen in the Louvre Museum in Paris: the winged victory of Samothrace, sometimes known as Nike, and the armless Aphrodite of Milos, also known as the Venus de Milo. These are just two of a large number of magnificent sculptures that have survived the centuries, each of them expressing an extraordinary sense of realism and movement that has inspired artists ever since, from the Romans to Michelangelo. In so many ways then, Hellenistic civilization was the context for extraordinary innovations, functioning as a commercial and cultural bridge between Europe and Asia, and between the Persian and Roman empires. But like every single civilization we will consider in this course, with a single exception thus far of modern civilization, because of internal revolts and civil war, the Hellenistic kingdoms eventually began to crumble. In the Balkans, the Antigonids lost control of Greece around 250 BCE, leading to a century of independence for the Greek polis until the Romans showed up. The newly independent Greek city-states formed themselves into different leagues and wrote constitutions that many have argued were influential in the framing of the Constitution of the United States of America, whose architects were well-versed in classical scholarship. The Seleucid Empire also struggled in the face of revolts, and by 250 BCE, large regions including Parthia, Bactria, Iran, and India had gained their independence. Bactria, the ancient name for modern Afghanistan, became the realm of a series of independent Greco-Bactrian rulers who controlled the region for about a century until it fell to militarized nomadic invaders in the mid-2nd century. The Seleucids managed to hold on to the western remnants of their empire until the Romans came marching into the region. The Romans were eventually confronted by a new imperial power that had established itself in Iran and Mesopotamia, the formidable Parthians, who used Persian-style provincial government to create an empire that lasted for more than 3 centuries. In Egypt, the Ptolemies successfully maintained their control, although they also fell to the Romans in 30 BCE under dramatic circumstances with the suicide of Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers. By any measure, the Hellenistic era, a direct product of the military campaign waged against the Persians by Alexander, was a dynamic period for large regions of Afro-Eurasia. It is a reminder to historians of just what sort of an impact one individual can have on history, even when viewed from the broadest of perspectives. This era of tremendous economic expansion, dominated by sophisticated cosmopolitan cities, and of astonishing innovations in philosophy, science, and art, as Greek civilization diffused widely through the region, can all be traced to Alexander's conquests. The immediate fate of the Hellenistic world was now to be incorporated into the Roman Empire, and this would be the context through which Greek civilization would become deeply embedded into Western civilization. As we contemplate the achievements of the Greeks over 2 millennia, from the Minoans to the Hellenistic era, it is clear that we are contemplating one of the most significant cultural legacies in all human history.